Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second of my contributions to this conference on inclusive physical education. So in this session, we're going to look at inclusive practice using examples from 4 games families. And again, my name is Ken Black. I'm an independent advisor on inclusive physical activity and sport, co-founder of the Inclusion Club, along with my colleague Peter Downs. I'll say more about that at the end. I'm also a trustee of the board of Limb Power, which is an organisation that represents people who have limb impairments in the UK in sport and the arts. And also I produce videos on adapted physical activity, some of which you will see as part of this presentation. But before we go into the presentation, I want to say something about the STEP adaptation tool, because this is something that will go through the whole presentation. And it's a very simple tool that you can use and apply in any activity and with any ability. So let me say a little bit about STEP and explain its use, and then we'll go into the session on games families. So the basics of STEP are, it's an acronym for space, task, equipment, and people. In space, for example, we might be looking at how we might manipulate the playing area, how we might change the distances from an individual to a target, or how we might modify the space. That's the space that everyone uses, or perhaps the space for some of the participants. T is for task, and what we're talking about here are things like different ways of doing the same activity. So different individuals, based on their function, might do things differently. And it's okay if that's what they do. We might also, under task, break skills down into smaller component parts so that young people who are developing skills can assimilate those tasks more easily. E is for equipment, and there's lots of different ways of looking at equipment, and we will look at that in a bit. How to modify and adapt regular equipment, so how we can use regular sports equipment in a modified way, or how we can create adapted equipment, sometimes using regular bits and pieces of equipment we might find around the home, but modify or adapt so that we can use it within an activity. And P for people. And that might be, we might look at ways of matching abilities so that people participate together with people whose function and ability is similar to theirs. We might manipulate team numbers in a team sport in order to balance an activity. And we might look specifically at individual needs and what kind of support each individual requires in order to be able to participate. So space, task, equipment, people, 4 parts of any activity that you can manipulate and change in order to make an activity more inclusive. So let's look at space. We can, for example, increase or decrease the size of the playing area. So, for example, if we have a small space, this encourages more interaction between the participants. It also means that the people whose mobility is inhibited don't have to cover so much space. A bigger space promotes increased mobility. So if we want people to move more, we can make the space bigger. In target activities, we can vary and change the distance to the target. So an individual can be closer to or further away from a target. For example, in basketball, football, golf, rugby, bocce, the Paralympic sport, and similar, we could, for example, say that if a shot is successful, then we move further away from the target. If the target is missed, then the next time we go closer. So we can always be flexible and enable people to achieve success. They achieve the success, increase the difficulty. And we can modify the playing space itself. So we can create, for example, ability-based zones, which are part of the whole game. So it enables people of different abilities to play the same game together, but we may have people of different abilities in different parts of the playing area. We can include safe zones, for example, people who feel vulnerable especially in an invasion game where there's a lot of people moving around, then they may be in a safe zone where they can't be marked by an opponent or tackled. So that means they've got time and space to, for example, receive a pass, look around and pass to someone on their team. So space and how we modify it is another part of the step equation. An example I might give is if we look at this basketball example. If we wanted to just play basketball, then everyone is moving everywhere. But we may have some people who are very mobile and others who are less mobile. So, for example, we can divide the basketball court longitudinally into 3 long ways zones. In the inside zone, we could have people who have mobility impairment, wheelchair users, people using sticks or walking frames to move around. They can be in that central zone and matched against people who are similar. In the outside zones, we could have perhaps ambulant people who might use perhaps one stick or a crutch. We might have people who are completely fully functional, non-disabled people in the outside zones. And they can play all together, so that all 4 players in the red team and all 4 players in the yellow team are on the same team. They're playing together and the ball can be passed between them, but they stay within their zone. So the more mobile players in the outside zones, the players with mobility impairment in the inside zones, and the ball can be passed in and out. The only thing we might restrict is that we don't enable players in the outside zone to pass all the way across to someone in the opposite outside zone. The ball has to go through the central zone so that people in the middle are always involved in the play. Anyone can score, anyone can pass and defend. So this is one way of manipulating space in order to bring different abilities together. Let's look at task. Task, how we adapt the way that we perform a skill, the way that we do a physical activity. And so we could, for example, send a ball, in this case, a paper ball, in different ways. We can do an underarm throw, we could propel it with the foot, or we could send the ball down a plastic chute, a plastic pipe, depending on the ability and the function of the individual. If we look at that more closely, in throwing, an underarm throw, an overarm throw, a dart type throw, we can break a skill down into smaller components. So if we looked at triple jump, hop, step, jump, we might teach each of those components individually before trying to combine them into a partial or a whole sequence. So we might connect the hop and the step, or maybe the step and the jump, before we would ask an individual to try and put the whole sequence together. So we can break complex skills down into more simple components and make them more accessible, therefore, to individuals. 3 main aspects of equipment. I like to, using regular equipment in a modified way. So we take regular balls and bats and other pieces of equipment and use them differently. So it can be just the way that in a racket sport, for example, we might use bigger bats to give people more reach or a better chance of striking a moving ball or a slow moving ball. We might use bigger bats than you would normally do in a particular activity. Using ordinary equipment in a modified way. Or we can adapt regular equipment for specific purposes and for the use by particular individuals. So we can take a regular piece of equipment, so a bat, for example, and we can attach that bat physically to someone's hand if they've got absent grip or even an amputation. You can attach the bat to the arm. If they can move their arm, then they can use the bat. And we can have specially adapted equipment. So that's equipment that's specially made for the purpose of including young people who have different special needs. Could be, for example, a ball which makes a sound. It has internal bells or rattles so that someone who has a vision impairment can hear and track the movement of the ball. Another thing about we could, for example, change the size of a ball to make throwing and catching easier or harder. So, for example, if you're thinking about sending and receiving, throwing and catching, we always teach this together as if it's one skill, when in fact it's two completely different skills. Now, most young people can throw and catch. It's part of the same. It's part of the same activity to them. But for a lot of young people who may have control or coordination difficulties, they may have to learn catching separately from throwing. And so in the case of ball size, a large ball is easier to catch. A small ball is easier to throw. So some young people may practice with a large ball for catching initially and a small ball for throwing to begin. Then move towards putting the two skills together. We can adapt regular equipment for specific purposes. So I mentioned sound balls. If you don't have a ball that has bells in it, you can easily make a sound ball by putting any ball inside a plastic bag, secure the bag with tape. When you roll the ball on the floor, the plastic crackles. And so someone that might have a vision impairment or have difficulty with tracking, perhaps spatial issues, they can follow the movement of the ball. Very simple to make sound ball. And we can have specially adapted equipment, things like bell balls, as I mentioned, foam javelins, so you can, they're easier to throw, lighter. Mobility equipment, obviously, we've mentioned like wheelchairs and frames and sticks people may have to use in order to move around more easily. And equipment made from the materials that you might have available. So newspapers, you can make paper balls for lots of games. Plastic water bottles, these can be targets or they can mark out a space. Or cardboard tubes. You can roll a ball down the tube towards a target. So we can make use of anything that we've got in the home environment, for example, to create adapted equipment. And finally, looking at people, we can adapt the way that players interact. So, for example, we can match players of similar ability for practice in small-sided games or in competition. So as I mentioned in the example under space, we could put players of similar abilities together in certain parts of the playing area. And they play against people who have similar skills. And that can help to involve them more in the game. If people who are still developing their skills are always playing with or against people whose skill level is higher, then sometimes they never get involved in the game because the skillful players dominate. We can also vary team numbers, and teams don't always have to be the same size. So it doesn't need to always be 5 against 5 or 11 against 11. Sometimes instead of 5 against 5, we might decide that it's easier to have 7 against 3. 7 players who are developing their skills can support each other against 3 players who've got a higher level of skill, but they have to work harder against the 7. And so that can balance again. And if we look at under people, at the specific requirements that some young people have, some people require one-to-one support. So that means, for example, they might require guidance and target orientation if they have a vision impairment. So someone positioned near a target, for example, clapping or calling in order to orientate a young person who has a vision impairment towards a target. Or alternative or innovative methods of communication and explanation for some young people. So we use a lot of demonstration rather than verbal communication. We might use tactile guidance, so touching a young person on different shoulders to indicate direction. So we can use methods of communication that young people are comfortable with and which will help them to understand and become involved in physical activities. So just a final sort of question or a thought about that. All teachers and sports coaches adapt and modify. Everybody adapts to a certain extent. And what we're thinking about under adapted physical activity is just extending this to include young people who have a wider range of abilities. And so you can use the STEP adaptation tool, space, task, equipment, people. You can make up your own STEP that's relevant to you in your own language, for example. I've helped in my work around the world. I've helped to develop versions of STEP in lots of different languages: Chinese, Arabic, Amharic in Ethiopia, in Malaysia, different languages, different parts of the world, Spanish, where STEP can be translated or a different word is used in order to. All we're looking for are 4 parts of an activity that we can change in order to make that activity more inclusive. And we can base this not just on physical impairment, but inclusion of all people based on age or gender, on their ability, or also their interest levels. So STEP, I think, is a useful tool, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time explaining that before we look at the video examples of the games. Just a book. There's a number of readings that I could recommend. This is just a chapter I did for a book a few years ago, but there's lots of other recommendations I can give. If you want to get in touch, my contact will be at the end, and I can suggest other useful reading. Okay, so we're going to look at games families, and we're going to look at target games, net and wall games, striking and fielding games, and invasion games. And we might focus particularly on 3 nice adapted games, 2 of which I think for sure you'll be familiar with, sitting volleyball and goalball, but also a game called floor curling. And you'll see when we get to that in the videos. So let's look at the first games family, and this one is target games and how we might apply STEP in the target game setting. And what I want to look at under target games is how we can make target games more interesting, because quite often for a lot of young people, it's just throwing something or sending something towards a target. And once they're successful, how can we make that more interesting? How can we change the activity so that it becomes more interesting for them? And also positioning. Positioning is quite vital. A lot of target games are static. And so the position that a person is in relation to the target is very important. And then looking at skill development, which leads to target game activities. So we can look, for instance, at boccia and then we'll look at this game called floor curling. Golf, of course, is a popular game all around the world and invented in Scotland. But you can play a game based on golf using very simple equipment, paper balls, bean bags, or even a pair of socks rolled up into a ball. As this game is a combination of throwing and golf, I call it throlf. Utilize whatever space you have available, whether that's outdoors or inside the home. Targets can be adapted in order to make them easier or more challenging. Different kinds of targets mean that young people have to propel the ball in different ways. And as in golf, you can create hazards, whether it's a water hazard or a sand bunker. So throlf tries to mirror the rules of golf. You throw your ball towards the target and you take your next shot from where the ball lands. If the ball goes out into a hazard, such as a water hazard, or into a bunker, you add 1 point to your score. So in a rudimentary way, young people are learning the basic rules of golf. In most target games, young people are playing from a static position. However, it's important that young people can learn how to reposition themselves and change the angle of their chair so that they can have the most effective throw towards the target. Most people are familiar with the Paralympic sport of boccia and also with the internationally recognized playing area, which is roughly based on the size of a badminton court or a squash court. When I worked in sports development, for example, I used to persuade the managers of the squash centres to add boccia markings to some of their courts, as it was almost an identical size. And of course, where we don't have official boccia equipment, we can improvise with the good old paper balls and poster paints. And of course, one of the key aspects in terms of inclusive physical activity about boccia is it can be played in any available space. We don't have to play in an official court. We can play in any outdoor or indoor space that's available. It's important that young people find the most effective way of propelling the ball for them, whether it's an underarm, whether it's overarm, whether it's a dart type throw, whether it's using the foot or an assistive device. The floor curling playing area is based on a badminton court and in fact uses some of its lines. The curling stones can be propelled in various ways using pushers, using a double arm action, using a single arm push. It's easy to vary the targets in order to create different challenges for young people. These challenges can include numeracy, creativity, and a challenge that's very much like snooker, allocating points to different sized balls. Or we can transpose the game of Throth that you saw earlier to floor curling. Okay, so now we're going to look at net and wall games. And net and wall games are games I think you'll all be familiar with, but games like tennis and squash and volleyball, for example. So we're going to look at skill and game development, and the examples we're going to check out are racket sports and sitting volleyball. That'll be the two that we look at most. Again, improvised equipment can actually help young people to develop coordination and control. And this is very useful in racket sports. And then begin without rackets, just concentrating on developing control and coordination and balance. We can introduce movement with control. And then games that introduce striking with control and movement. So the progression is from balance to bounce. So reduced versions of the game can help young people to develop a better control and coordination. If the players are further apart, they have more reaction time. If they're closer together, they don't have to strike the ball so far. So it's finding a balance between these elements. We can slow the game down, play in a reduced space, or play in a larger space where young people can use more power in order to cater for different abilities. Sitting volleyball is played in a smaller court, and this is to reflect reduced player movement. But essentially, many other aspects of the game are identical to the standing version. But of course, the playing space can be endlessly improvised. And finally, volley-all is a way of integrating standing and seated players together in the same game. Okay, so next we're going to look at striking and fielding games, and these, the way that I'm developing these games families is in a deliberate order. Target games, static. Net and wall games, generally the person is defending one side of a net or one side of a court. So they have one area that they have to think about. And now we're looking at striking and fielding, which involves a little bit more movement. But again, there's specific ways that people participate, whether they're batting, striking, or whether they're fielding. And so it's a sort of a progression. And you'll see when we get to the final stage what I mean. We're going to look here at skill and game development, and we're going to look at T-ball, a simplified baseball type game, and we're going to look at the great English game of cricket. T-ball, which is based loosely on baseball, softball, or rounders, provides an incredible vehicle for enabling people of different abilities to play together in a striking and fielding activity. As in softball and baseball, the players score by striking the ball and traveling between the bases. The fielders, meanwhile, try to reach any base before the batter gets there. The distance between the bases can be adjusted to suit the ability of the players. An important concept is to keep the rules as flexible as possible and try and adjust the space, the playing area, the rules of competition, the way in which people strike the ball. All of these things can be changed. For example, where moving between the bases isn't an option, then people can score by hitting the ball into zones. In the follow the leader game, the whole batting team run, and at the same time, the fielding team perform a task as a group. The idea is the batting team try to get round as many bases as possible before the fielding team complete their task. In this way, every player in both teams is active all the time. In a similar way, the game of cricket can be adapted. The way that players strike or bowl the ball, the distance that they have to travel in order to score a run, the number of players, the way that they interact, all of these things can be adjusted. So lastly, we're going to look at invasion games. And invasion games have the most complexity of all games. And sometimes invasion games are the activities that teachers and coaches find the most difficult in terms of including all abilities. So I want to try and show a few examples of how we can overcome these issues. So we're going to look again at skill and game development, but the examples we're going to use are football and hockey. And goalball, which you could argue is kind of got elements of a net wall game, but I always like to include it under invasion because you are invading the other team's space, although the players don't interact in goalball as they would in some other invasion games. So let's look at those examples. In this inclusive football program, you can see the players playing games which help them to develop specific skills which they can take into the full game. So in this game, for example, the players have to avoid each other, first without the ball and then whilst keeping the ball under control. In this game, the players dribble the ball to specific points around the playing area. And in this, they work in pairs to take the ball through as many gates as possible. This game is about passing and intercepting. And here the players can control and strike the ball in ways that suit their specific abilities. And this activity is to help develop shooting skills, where players aim at targets set at different distances and different widths. Hockey is a game that can be adapted in many ways. It's particularly suitable as an indoor game for people of mixed ability. I wanted to share this particular variation, bench hockey, which is a very simple setup, 2 benches turned on the side, a goal at either end, and the teams are trying to propel the ball through the opposing team's goal. This game helps players to develop manipulative stick control without having to be concerned also about movement. An official goalball court is the same size as a volleyball court. Goalball is a Paralympic sport played by vision-impaired athletes. Each team has 3 players, and the object is to roll a heavy bell ball across the opposing team's end line. As all goalball players must wear eye shades, the balls have internal bells to help players track the movement. But a sound ball can be improvised by placing any ball inside a plastic bag and securing with tape. The ball crackles when it rolls on the ground. The lines on a goalball court are tactile to help players orientate themselves. And as all players must wear eye shades, it means that sighted and vision-impaired players can play together. The game can be adapted for all abilities. Players defend by forming a long barrier, and the ball can be propelled in many different ways according to the player's ability. Okay, thank you for your attention, and I hope it's been interesting. If you've got any questions, I think you can do this via chat or through the organisers. And this is my contact email if you want to send me any questions direct, ken@theinclusionclub.com.